A familiar place, a familiar face. Sarah stepped into the familiar comfort of the diner, the door chiming softly as it opened. The day had only just begun, but the diner was already alive with the rhythm of clinking cups, sizzling bacon, and the low hum of conversations. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the comforting aromas of eggs, toast, and hash browns. She breathed it in deeply as if it were a part of her own being. This place, this constant, this home away from home. Her apron was already waiting for her on the back of the counter. A simple blue one, its edges frayed but clean. As Sarah tied it around her waist, she felt a sense of readiness wash over her. She had been working at the corner diner for years, and it had become an extension of herself, an anchor in a world that often felt too vast and unpredictable. This little corner of the world was where she had found purpose, where her voice could be heard through the clinking of plates and the steady hum of morning chatter. She adjusted her ponytail, the dark curls falling over her shoulders in soft waves. Her smile, bright and warm, stretched across her face effortlessly as she walked out from behind the counter. Her brown eyes sparkled with the kind of joy only a person who truly loved what they did could know. "Good morning, everyone," she called out cheerfully, her voice carrying above the chatter of patrons. It was a greeting that had become second nature, like the familiar routine of making coffee or refilling water glasses. She had worked here for as long as she could remember, and every morning, no matter how tired or weary she might feel, she could not help but feel a wave of joy at the sight of her regulars. They were not just customers. They were her extended family, her community. The chorus of voices responded in kind. "Morning, Sarah. How's it going, Sarah? Hi, Sarah." It was as though the entire diner had risen together in a unified greeting, and her heart swelled. It was moments like this that made the early mornings worth it. She felt loved here, seen in a way that wasn't often the case outside these walls. She moved gracefully through the diner, her eyes scanning the booths for her regulars. At the corner booth near the window, Mr. Harris, a retired war veteran, sat with his usual newspaper spread out in front of him. His thick glasses rested low on his nose, but his smile, warm and genuine, never wavered. "The usual, Mr. Harris?" Sarah asked as she approached him. He looked up at her, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "You know me too well, Sarah," he chuckled, adjusting his glasses. "I don't think you've ever gotten my order wrong." Sarah poured his coffee, letting the rich, dark liquid fill the mug until it was just the right amount. "How's the leg today?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Mr. Harris sighed, rubbing his knee. "Better, I suppose. Getting old's no fun, kiddo. But I'm tough. It'll take more than an aching leg to keep me down." Sarah smiled warmly, handing him his coffee. "Well, you've got to stay tough for your morning paper, right?" He chuckled, taking a sip. "I'll make it through," he said with a wink. "Besides, I've got you making my coffee. What more could a man ask for?" Sarah laughed softly, her eyes sparkling. "I'm glad to be of service." She turned to make her way to another table, but paused as she spotted someone else. Mrs. Peterson, a newcomer to town, was sitting alone in a corner booth, her shoulders slumped and her eyes downcast. Sarah noticed how the woman seemed to withdraw into herself, as if she were trying to become invisible in the bustling diner. The older woman had started coming in a few days ago, and although she wasn't a regular, Sarah couldn't help but notice the quiet sadness that seemed to hover around her. With a gentle nod to Mr. Harris, Sarah excused herself and walked toward Mrs. Peterson's booth. She didn't want to pry, but she couldn't stand seeing someone so lonely. There was something about Mrs. Peterson's hunched posture that made Sarah's heart ache with empathy. She had seen it before. The invisible burden that people carried, often without anyone noticing. "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson," Sarah said softly, her voice warm but respectful of the woman's solitude. She didn't want to crowd her but couldn't help but reach out. "How are you this morning?" The older woman looked up, startled at first, as though she hadn't expected anyone to speak to her. Her eyes, a soft shade of gray, seemed distant, clouded by something Sarah couldn't quite place. Mrs. Peterson was a striking woman, her silver hair neatly pulled back into a bun, but there was an air of weariness about her that made Sarah want to help, even though she didn't know how. "I'm fine," Mrs. Peterson replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands rested on the table, folded neatly, as if they were waiting for something or someone. Sarah smiled gently, sensing that the older woman wasn't in the mood for small talk, but also wasn't used to being seen. "I'll bring you your eggs in a moment," she said softly. "Just let me know if you need anything." As Sarah turned to walk away, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important she needed to do for this woman. Mrs. Peterson had a quiet grace about her, but the sadness in her eyes told a different story, one Sarah felt compelled to understand. She returned to the counter, her mind lingering on the woman in the corner booth. What was it that had brought her here, to this town, to this diner? And why did she seem so alone? Before she could dwell on it too much, Sarah was interrupted by a voice calling out to her. "Sarah, over here." It was Mr. Johnson, a retired teacher who had been coming to the diner for nearly 2 decades. He was always full of energy, always ready with a story or a question about the latest news. As Sarah made her way to his booth, she couldn't help but feel a sense of comfort in his familiar face. She had known Mr. Johnson since she was a child, and even though he was a bit older now, his sharp mind and quick wit hadn't dulled in the slightest. "Morning, Mr. Johnson." "The usual?" Sarah asked, already reaching for the coffee pot. Mr. Johnson gave a hearty laugh, his eyes twinkling behind his glasses. "Of course, Sarah. You know me too well. How's your son doing?" Sarah's heart warmed at the mention of James, her son. He was 12 now, growing like a weed, and every day she saw a little more of her own spark in him. "He's doing well," she replied, pouring his coffee with practiced ease. "He's got this big science project coming up, and he's been talking about it nonstop. I think he might be a little too excited about it." Mr. Johnson chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm sure he takes after his mother," he said with a wink. "Always eager to learn, always curious." Sarah smiled, her eyes glinting with affection. "I hope so. I just want him to follow his dreams, like I've always tried to do." As she filled his cup, Sarah couldn't help but think about what her own dreams were. There were so many things she wished for, things she didn't even dare to voice out loud. But as she glanced around the diner, at the people who had come to be like family, she realized something important. Her dream was right here. It was serving this community, creating connections, and bringing a little joy to their everyday lives. But there was always more, wasn't there? Something beyond this, something she hadn't yet touched. As she turned away to serve another table, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if today would be the day something new, something extraordinary, would find its way into her life. A quiet connection. The days seemed to blur together for Sarah. Morning after morning, she followed her familiar routine, serving the same regulars, exchanging pleasantries with everyone in the diner. But there was always something different about Marcus. Despite his quiet demeanor and reserved presence, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he let on. There was a depth in his eyes, a sadness that hovered just beneath the surface. She had seen it before in others. People who carried burdens that no one could see but were always there, weighing them down. Every morning, Marcus arrived at the same time, seated at the same booth by the window. He would order nothing but a glass of water, staring out at the world beyond the diner's windows. His eyes seemed distant, lost in a place far removed from the bustling energy of the diner. It was almost as if the world inside and outside had no meaning to him. And Sarah could feel it, a quiet sort of grief that never quite left him. She had taken to checking in on him more frequently, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine curiosity and concern. One morning, she made her way over to his booth just as he was reaching for his glass. His fingers hovered for a moment over the rim before he picked it up, as if deliberating whether to take a drink or not. "Morning, Marcus," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying a gentle warmth. He looked up, startled at first, but his lips curved into a faint, reluctant smile. "Oh, hey, Sarah," he replied, his voice quiet but polite. "I'll just have my usual." "You know, you're the only person in here who orders just water," she said, her tone teasing, trying to bring some lightness into the conversation. "Don't you ever get tempted by the coffee or the pancakes?" He chuckled softly, though it lacked the usual humor. "Maybe one day," he said with a small shake of his head, his gaze drifting back toward the window. "But I like the quiet. The water's good for now." Sarah set the glass down in front of him, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. "Quiet can be nice," she agreed, but she couldn't help noticing how the silence between them felt heavier than most. "But you know," she added, her voice softening, "sometimes the quiet can also be a little lonely." He glanced up at her then, his expression shifting slightly. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a brief flicker of something raw. For a moment, Sarah thought he might say something, might open up, but he didn't. Instead, he just looked away again, as if retreating into the safety of his own thoughts. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but sometimes it's just easier that way." Sarah didn't push him further. Instead, she just nodded, her gaze lingering on him for a moment before she moved back toward the counter. She knew better than to rush someone into sharing their pain. It had taken her years to open up about her own struggles after all. Everyone had their own timing. As the morning wore on, Sarah couldn't help but notice that Marcus seemed more withdrawn than usual. There was something different about him today, something in the way he held himself. His posture, usually so straight, was now slightly slouched, his gaze fixed downward. She could sense that he was lost in his own thoughts, wrestling with something deep within himself. She went about her usual duties, serving coffee, delivering orders, chatting with the regulars. But in the back of her mind, Marcus lingered. It was as though a pull had begun to form between them, something unspoken but undeniable. She wanted to help him, to reach out, but she didn't know how. Around mid-morning, after the breakfast rush had calmed down, Sarah found herself refilling coffee cups and clearing plates when she noticed Marcus watching her. He hadn't said a word for nearly an hour, but now his gaze was fixed on her. She couldn't quite place the look in his eyes. It wasn't sadness, exactly, but something else. It was as though he was observing her from a distance, trying to piece together something he hadn't yet figured out. When she caught his gaze, he quickly looked away, as though embarrassed. Sarah felt a wave of sympathy for him, sensing that he was struggling with something that ran far deeper than what he showed on the outside. She felt a gentle tug at her heart. There was a loneliness about him, a sense of isolation that mirrored a part of her own life. She, too, knew what it was like to feel invisible in a world full of people. But she also knew that sometimes all someone needed was to be seen, to be acknowledged. Deciding to break the silence, Sarah walked over to his booth again. She wasn't going to push him to talk, but she could offer him a sense of connection, even if only for a few minutes. "Marcus, you're awfully quiet today," she said with a light smile, her tone inviting without being intrusive. "Is everything okay?" He looked up at her then, his face softening. For a moment, he didn't respond, just stared at her with an intensity that made her heart beat a little faster. But then, his shoulders slumped slightly, and he sighed. "It's just, I've been thinking a lot," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "About everything. About what I'm doing with my life. I used to have so many plans, so many dreams." His eyes dropped to the table, his fingers tracing the rim of his empty glass. "But after the accident, everything changed. It feels like I lost everything." Sarah sat down across from him, her eyes softening with understanding. She had never been in a wheelchair, but she knew what it was like to feel like your life had been ripped away from you. It wasn't an easy thing to explain, but she could feel his pain in her bones. The loss of something you thought was permanent, the overwhelming shift in your world when the future you imagined no longer existed. "I can't even remember what it felt like to have control," Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I used to be so independent, so sure of myself. And now, I'm just stuck." His hands clenched into fists, and for the first time, Sarah saw the rawness in his expression, the frustration and helplessness that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. Sarah reached across the table, placing a hand gently on his. She wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but she couldn't help herself. She knew what it was like to feel lost, to need someone to just listen. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she said softly, her voice filled with empathy. "I can't pretend to know what you're going through, but I know that you're not alone. And I know that you're stronger than you think. It's okay to feel lost sometimes. It's okay to need help." He looked up at her, and for a moment, Sarah saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the beginning of something, some small shift. Maybe it was the realization that he didn't have to carry this weight alone. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't expect anyone to understand. I didn't think anyone would even care." Sarah smiled softly. "Well, I care," she said simply. "And I'm here, anytime you want to talk." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, but instead felt like the quiet before a storm, a space filled with unspoken understanding. In that moment, Sarah knew that something had shifted, not just for Marcus, but for her too. They had both reached across the divide, offering each other a lifeline in the form of words and simple kindness. As she stood to leave, Sarah glanced down at the table, where the empty glass of water sat. It felt symbolic, empty, but not without potential. There was still a lot of life to be filled in that glass, a lot of things that were still waiting to be seen. And maybe, just maybe, they would both find the courage to fill that space together. The weight of silence. The next few days seemed to blur into one another, each morning greeted with the familiar clang of the diner's bell, the rich aroma of coffee, and the routine chatter of the regulars. But for Sarah, nothing felt quite the same. Her thoughts often wandered back to Marcus, his quiet eyes, his guarded heart, the pain that seemed to pulse beneath every interaction. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between them, that the invisible thread connecting them had begun to tighten. As she went about her usual routine, Sarah found herself stealing glances at Marcus more often than before. She noticed how his posture had shifted. He no longer slumped in his chair, but sat more upright, his hands resting flat on the table, as if bracing himself. And though he still didn't order much, his presence had changed. There was a stillness about him now, something almost magnetic. He wasn't just a man in a wheelchair. He was a man with a story, a man with a future that had yet to be written. Sarah's interactions with him had become more frequent, more deliberate. It wasn't just small talk anymore. It wasn't just the occasional check-in. She found herself lingering by his booth a little longer, asking him more questions, sharing more of herself. He didn't speak much, but he listened, and sometimes that was enough. They didn't need to fill the space with words. The unspoken understanding was enough to fill the gaps. One afternoon, Sarah was walking past his booth when she noticed him staring at the door, lost in thought. His gaze was distant, like he was seeing something far beyond the diner's glass walls. She paused for a moment, unsure if she should interrupt his reverie. But the pull inside her, the need to connect, to offer some small piece of herself, was too strong. "Marcus," she called gently, and his head turned toward her, his face softening when he saw her. "Sarah," he said quietly, almost as if he hadn't expected her to approach. His eyes flickered with something, a quiet, almost reluctant recognition. "I didn't see you there." She smiled, a small, tender smile, as she leaned against the edge of the booth. "You're always a little lost in thought, aren't you?" He chuckled, a low sound though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, I guess so. I spend a lot of time in my head these days." Sarah's heart ached at his words, at the hollow sadness that lingered in his voice. She had known that feeling all too well, The weight of silence, the crushing weight of thoughts you couldn't escape, of a mind that ran faster than your heart could keep up with. But instead of retreating, she pushed forward. "Is it hard?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the sincerity that she felt deep inside. "To be alone with your thoughts all the time." Marcus took a slow breath, his hands tightening around the armrests of his chair. His gaze dropped to the table, as if searching for the right words. For a long moment, Sarah thought he might not answer. But then he spoke, his voice low and heavy. "Sometimes," he said, his words tinged with weariness, "it's like my mind never stops. There's always something churning, something I can't shake off. I used to be able to drown it out with work, with the hustle and bustle. But now," he trailed off, shaking his head slowly, "now I just don't know how to fill the silence. And sometimes it feels like I'm being swallowed by it." Sarah's chest tightened, and she couldn't stop herself from reaching out, placing a hand on his. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a simple touch, a small offering of comfort. But it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I get it," she said quietly, her voice steady but full of understanding. "I don't have all the answers, Marcus, but I know what it feels like to be caught in your own head, to feel like there's no escape from the noise. I've felt that way too. But it doesn't last forever. Sometimes it takes finding a way to let the noise out, to find someone, or something, that makes it quieter." He looked at her then, his gaze intense, as though he were trying to see through the layers of her words, trying to find the truth behind them. His eyes softened, but the shadow of his internal struggle was still there, lingering. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that yet," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to let go of all this anger, this regret. I don't know where to start." Sarah squeezed his hand lightly, offering him a quiet strength, a wordless promise that he didn't have to face it alone. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You just have to take one small step. And that's enough. I'll be here, Marcus. No rush." For the first time since they had met, Marcus didn't pull away. He didn't retreat into the quiet shell that he had so carefully built around himself. Instead, he let his hand rest in hers for a moment longer. And in that brief silence, Sarah felt something shift between them, something deeper than words could explain. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Marcus's routine continued to evolve. It wasn't anything dramatic, not yet. But small changes began to take root. Marcus started coming in earlier, staying longer. He ordered more than just water. Sometimes, he'd have a cup of coffee, sometimes a bowl of soup. Occasionally, he'd ask for extra butter with his toast. An innocuous thing, but for Sarah, it felt like progress. It was like he was testing the waters, slowly learning to let the world in again. Their conversations became less guarded. They shared more about themselves, about their lives, their losses, their small victories. Sarah learned that Marcus had once been a successful architect before the accident had changed everything. He had designed homes, buildings that stood as monuments to his creativity. But now, everything seemed like a distant memory. His hands, which had once drawn plans and crafted models, now rested motionless in his lap. She also learned that he wasn't without hope. Despite everything, there was a flicker of determination in his eyes, a quiet resolve to rebuild, to find something worth living for. But the road was long. And sometimes, when Sarah looked at him, she could see how exhausted he was from fighting his own mind, from trying to find the courage to begin again. It was on a particularly quiet afternoon, after the lunch rush had died down, that Marcus did something completely unexpected. As Sarah brought his coffee over, she noticed him staring at her, a strange look on his face. His expression was pensive, almost hesitant, as if he were weighing his words carefully. "Sarah," he began, his voice lower than usual, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About the silence, about letting go." She set the coffee cup down in front of him, her eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity. "And," she prompted gently, sensing that he was finally ready to speak the words that had been weighing on him. "I think." He trailed off, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of his mug. "I think I want to try. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I think I'm ready to start taking those small steps you talked about." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was something far more powerful. It was the first step, the first sign that Marcus was beginning to trust again, beginning to open up to the possibility of healing. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "That's all anyone can ask for. One step at a time." His eyes met hers then, and for the first time, Sarah saw something new in them. Hope. It was tentative, fragile, but it was there, quietly flickering like a candle in the dark. And in that moment, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever journey Marcus had ahead of him, she would be there, right by his side. The weight of silence no longer had to be borne alone. And together, they would find a way to fill the space with something new. A life transformed. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of freshly baked bread and the distant hum of cars along the street. The diner had settled into its usual rhythm, the soft clink of silverware punctuating the occasional bursts of conversation. Sarah was wiping down the counter, her thoughts wandering as they so often did now, back to Marcus and the quiet but powerful shifts in him over the past few weeks. She had noticed how his demeanor had softened, how he seemed less burdened by the weight of the past, and for the first time in months, there was a glimmer of light in his eyes. Marcus had begun coming in more regularly, not just for coffee, but for meals. The silence between them had become less of a chasm and more of a space where comfort could settle. They no longer exchanged words only out of politeness. There was meaning behind every conversation, every glance. It wasn't that everything was fixed, far from it. But there was a shift in the air when Marcus was around, as if he were finally learning to open up, to embrace the present moment, instead of living only in the shadows of his past. One morning, as Sarah served a table of loud, laughing tourists, she caught sight of Marcus sitting in his usual booth, staring out the window. It was a look she'd come to recognize. A contemplative silence, a quiet space where thoughts weighed heavily, perhaps too heavily, on his mind. But today, there was something different. There was no sadness in his gaze, no lingering grief. Instead, there was focus, an intensity that caught Sarah off guard. His eyes met hers across the room, and without a word, he motioned for her to come over. There was an energy in the gesture, a sense of purpose she hadn't seen before. Sarah excused herself from the tourists and walked over to him, her heart racing with curiosity. When she reached his booth, she saw that his expression had softened, but the energy was still there, alive, almost urgent. "Sarah," Marcus began, his voice quieter than usual but firm, as if he had finally found the courage to say what had been building in him. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said last time. About taking small steps, about letting go of the weight of everything. I think I'm ready to do something." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had heard the uncertainty in his voice before, but this was different. It was steady, determined. "What do you mean?" she asked gently, her eyes locking with his, sensing that this wasn't just another passing thought. This was something real. Marcus took a slow breath, his hands resting on the table as he spoke. "I don't know how to explain it, but I've been in this place, this limbo for so long, just existing. And I don't want to exist anymore. I want to live. I want to be a part of something again, something that means something. And I can't do it alone." Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her, the weight of his words settling deep within her. She had always known that Marcus was capable of so much more than he gave himself credit for, but hearing him say it out loud was something different. It was the first time he was allowing himself to hope again, to believe that he could move forward. And it filled Sarah with a warmth she couldn't fully describe. "You don't have to do it alone," she said softly, her voice thick with sincerity. "Whatever it is, I'm here. I've always been here, Marcus's eyes softened at her words, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't look away. His gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. There was something in his eyes, something that made Sarah's heart flutter, something that made her believe in the possibility of change, of growth, of new beginnings. "I know," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. "And I think I want to start by getting out of here, away from the diner, away from my apartment. I want to see the world again, even if it's just a small part of it. I want to find out if there's something left for me." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with pride and tenderness. This was a huge step for him. It wasn't just about moving his body anymore. It was about moving his soul, reclaiming something that had been lost in the wake of the accident. It was about learning to trust the world again, to trust that there was more waiting for him beyond the confines of his wheelchair and the walls of his home. "I think that's a great idea," Sarah said with a soft smile, her eyes sparkling with warmth. "Where do you want to go?" Marcus hesitated, his brow furrowing as he thought. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been so focused on the past that I've forgotten what I used to enjoy. I don't even remember what it feels like to just live. Maybe I'll start by just taking a walk, getting out into the fresh air, a new place, a new perspective." Sarah smiled brightly, her heart swelling with happiness for him. "You don't have to know exactly where to go. Just start somewhere. It's all about the first step." And so, for the first time in a long while, Marcus left the diner with a sense of purpose. It wasn't about running away or escaping. It was about embracing life again, even in its small, quiet moments. Sarah watched him go, a sense of hope rising within her. She had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. And today, she saw the first cracks in the walls he had built around himself. Over the next few weeks, Marcus continued to show up, not just at the diner, but in his own life. He began to venture out more, walking through the park, spending time at the lake, and even returning to his old favorite spots in the city. He wasn't doing it for anyone else. He was doing it for himself. And that, Sarah realized, was the most important step of all. But one afternoon, something unexpected happened. As Sarah was setting a coffee cup down in front of a table of tourists, she noticed Marcus sitting at his booth, his hands shaking slightly. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by something she hadn't seen in him before, something like fear, something deep and unspoken. She set the coffee pot down and rushed over to him, her heart in her throat. "Marcus, are you okay?" she asked gently, her voice full of concern. Marcus looked up at her, his face pale, and for a moment, he didn't speak. His eyes were wide, and his breath seemed shallow. Sarah's stomach tightened with worry. "I don't know," he said, his voice trembling. "I've been doing well, but today, everything feels too much. It's like I've taken too many steps, and I don't know how to stop. I'm scared, Sarah. I'm scared I'm going to lose it all again." Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm, offering her steady presence. "Marcus," she said softly, "it's okay to feel scared. It doesn't mean you failed. You're doing something incredible just by showing up every day. You've already come so far." He took a shaky breath, looking at her with vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. What if I fall back? What if I can't handle it?" "Then we'll deal with it together," Sarah said firmly, squeezing his arm gently. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm right here with you." In that moment, Marcus felt something shift again. It wasn't a magic cure, nor was it a perfect resolution, but it was something deeper. Sarah wasn't just a waitress, she was a lifeline. And with her by his side, he felt he could face whatever came next. The fear of the unknown. The diner had become Sarah's sanctuary. The familiar hum of chatter, the clinking of silverware, and the warm smell of coffee brewing were constant companions. But despite the comfort it provided, there were days when Sarah felt an undercurrent of uncertainty creeping in. Marcus's absence, while not constant, was starting to feel significant. He had been coming in less and less, only returning occasionally for coffee or a quick meal, and his once deep but gentle conversations had become sparse. Sarah couldn't ignore the pit in her stomach. She wanted to believe that Marcus was still on his journey toward healing, that the quiet moments of progress hadn't been erased by the sudden retreat into silence. But a small part of her feared that he was slipping away again, the same fear she'd seen in him during their early days together, when the weight of the past had nearly consumed him, was back. It was just harder to see this time, harder to grasp, because it wasn't the obvious sadness or anger. This was something quieter, something more insidious. Fear. Sarah leaned against the counter, her gaze wandering to the window, watching the cars pass by in the late afternoon light. It had been 2 weeks since Marcus had taken those first steps, his decision to re-enter the world and reclaim pieces of his life. And yet, each day she found herself waiting, hoping for more signs, more courage from him. But Marcus was still in the process of sorting out his own heart, still wrestling with his internal battles. And then, just as she was beginning to lose herself in a swirl of thoughts, the bell above the diner door chimed. It was a familiar sound, one that always sent a little ripple of anticipation through Sarah's chest. She turned to see Marcus slowly roll in, his expression unreadable. Her heart gave a small leap. She put down the rag she was wiping the counter with and walked over to his booth, a smile tugging at her lips. "Hey you," she greeted warmly. "It's good to see you." Marcus didn't immediately return the smile. Instead, he stared down at the table, his fingers lightly tapping against the edge of his chair. He was visibly tense, his body stiff in a way that Sarah hadn't seen before. For a moment, Sarah felt a sharp pang of concern. This wasn't the Marcus she had come to know. This wasn't the Marcus who had been opening up to her slowly, piece by piece. "Marcus, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but full of the care she couldn't hide. "You seem off today." He didn't look up at her right away. Instead, his eyes focused on a small crack in the wood of the table, as if finding solace in the tiny imperfection. Finally, he sighed deeply, a low sound filled with frustration and doubt. "I'm not sure, Sarah," he admitted, his voice rough. "I thought I was doing better. I thought I was making progress. But now it feels like I'm stuck. Like every time I take a step forward, I take 2 steps back. I don't know how to keep going. It's just hard." Sarah's chest tightened. She had seen this before, the moment when someone who had made strides in their healing found themselves at a crossroads, unsure of whether they could continue. She slid into the seat across from him, leaning forward slightly, her eyes soft with understanding. "I know it's hard," she said, her voice steady. "You're pushing yourself, Marcus, and sometimes when you push too hard, it feels like you've hit a wall. But that doesn't mean you failed. It just means that it's okay to slow down, to catch your breath." He met her gaze, but there was no relief in his eyes. The same storm that had been brewing beneath the surface was now visible. "I don't know how to slow down. I don't know how to live without feeling like I'm constantly struggling. Every time I try to move forward, I remember what I lost. The life I had, the things I could do. And it feels like no matter what I do, I can't get it back." Sarah's heart broke for him. She could feel the weight of his words, the burden of grief and anger he was still carrying. But it was clear that he hadn't allowed himself to grieve fully, hadn't allowed himself to experience the pain that came with accepting what had been lost. And the fear of truly confronting that loss was what was holding him back now. "You don't have to get everything back, Marcus," she said softly. "You don't have to return to who you were, but you can move forward into who you are now. And maybe that's not the same person, but that doesn't mean you're any less than you were before. Sometimes the hardest part is accepting the change, accepting the journey. It's not about fixing everything. It's about learning to live with it, to move forward anyway." He was quiet for a long time, his eyes downcast as if mulling over her words. Sarah let the silence stretch between them, her presence steady and unwavering. She wasn't going to push him. She wasn't going to tell him everything would be okay, because that would be a lie. But she would stand by him, offering whatever comfort she could. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice tinged with vulnerability. I don't know if I can let go of the fear. I don't know if I can ever accept the way my life has changed. Sarah reached out, placing her hand gently on his. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was just a small, comforting touch. But it spoke volumes. You don't have to let go of everything all at once. It's okay to be scared, Marcus. It's okay to not have all the answers. But you don't have to carry that fear by yourself. I'm here, and I'll help you carry it. One step at a time. For the first time since he had walked into the diner that day, Marcus's expression softened. The tightness around his eyes relaxed slightly, and he allowed his hand to rest in hers, a silent acceptance of her offer of support. I don't deserve your kindness, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. You've been nothing but patient with me, but I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to live the life I had before. I don't know if I can ever be the man I was. Sarah squeezed his hand gently, a small, reassuring smile playing on her lips. You're not meant to be the man you were. You're meant to be the man you are now, with all of your struggles and triumphs. You've already shown me so much courage just by being here, just by continuing to try. That's more than most people can say. Marcus's gaze lifted to meet hers, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a faint flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I'll try, he said quietly, his voice steadying. I'll try to move forward, one step at a time. Over the following days, Sarah continued to be a constant presence in Marcus's life. Their conversations deepened, the silences between them growing more comfortable, more meaningful. He began to share more of his past with her, pieces of himself that he had kept hidden for so long. He told her about the days before the accident, the dreams he had once had, the love he'd lost, and the guilt that haunted him. And in turn, Sarah opened up as well. She shared her own fears, her own struggles, the things that kept her up at night. She revealed her deep desire to one day open her own diner, to make a place for people to feel as safe and loved as she did when she was behind the counter. Through their conversations, they slowly began to rebuild their own sense of self. Marcus was starting to confront his past, but he was also beginning to see a new future. And Sarah, in her quiet way, was learning to believe in her dreams again, to trust that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. One evening, as the diner quieted after the dinner rush, Sarah sat down across from Marcus at his usual booth. The dim lights above cast a warm glow over the table, and the air felt thick with unspoken words. I've been thinking, Marcus began, his voice low but firm. Maybe it's time I stop running from the future. Maybe it's time I start living in it. Sarah smiled softly, her heart fluttering with hope. I think that sounds like a great idea. And for the first time, in a long while, Marcus smiled back. Embracing the future, the diner had always been a place where Sarah found comfort, a steady rhythm that anchored her to something real and enduring. But now, as she looked around the familiar surroundings, it felt different. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a shift that she couldn't quite place. For the past several weeks, she had seen Marcus transform in ways she hadn't anticipated. He was no longer the man who lived in the shadow of his past, afraid of what the future held. He was becoming something new, something braver, more open, and more determined. But even with this progress, there were still moments when doubt crept in. It was those moments that tested him, that tested them both. Sarah could see the cracks, feel the weight of what lay beneath the surface, and as much as she wanted to help him, she also knew that the hardest battles were the ones he had to face alone. That morning, the diner was particularly busy. It was a Saturday, and the breakfast rush had already filled the place with the usual clamor. But Sarah's mind wasn't fully in the hustle of serving customers. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Marcus. He hadn't been in the diner for a few days, and although part of her understood that he needed space, a knot of worry twisted in her stomach. Had he regressed? Was he falling back into the isolation that had once consumed him? She wiped down the counter, trying to focus on the tasks at hand. It wasn't until a familiar voice called her name that she snapped back to reality. Sarah. She turned and saw Marcus standing at the door, his wheelchair positioned just outside. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she couldn't quite read his expression. It was a mix of uncertainty and something else, a quiet intensity, as if he were about to say something that would change everything. Marcus, she called, a smile breaking across her face despite the unease she felt. You're back. I was starting to think you've forgotten about me. He smiled, but it was faint, a shadow of his usual warmth. Not forgotten. Just needed some time to think. She motioned for him to come in, and he wheeled himself to his usual booth. There was a new energy around him, one that she couldn't quite place. He was different, but there was something more, something unspoken that hung in the air. As she walked over to his table, her heart raced with curiosity. How've you been? You've been quiet lately. Marcus sighed, his gaze shifting to the window as if he could find answers in the passing cars outside. I've been thinking a lot about everything. About what you said, the part about moving forward, about letting go of the past. And it's harder than I thought it would be. Sarah sat down across from him, her gaze soft but steady. She had seen this struggle before. The moment when someone reaches the precipice of change, but hesitates to take that final step. She knew that whatever he was about to say, it was important. You've come so far, Marcus, she said, her voice gentle but firm. You've made more progress than you realize. Just by showing up, by facing each day, you're already moving forward. The past doesn't define you. It's your actions now that matter. Marcus nodded slowly, but there was a heaviness to him that she couldn't ignore. He looked at her, his eyes searching for something. I know. I hear you. But I've been thinking, what if I can't fully move on? What if there's always going to be this part of me that's broken? I've come a long way, but there's still so much I'm holding on to, so much I don't know how to let go of. Sarah's heart ached for him. She could see the fear and frustration in his eyes, the fear of never fully healing, of never being able to truly let go. And it was in that moment, as he spoke from a place of raw vulnerability, that she realized something. Marcus wasn't just battling his past. He was afraid of the future. Afraid that he might not have a place in it. Afraid that he might never be able to fully embrace the life that was waiting for him. Marcus, she said softly, reaching across the table to place a hand over his. You don't have to let go of everything all at once. You don't have to have all the answers right now, but you've come so far already. And the fact that you're still here, still trying, that's what matters. You're not broken. You're healing. And it's okay to not have it all figured out. Just take it one step at a time. That's all any of us can do. For a moment, Marcus didn't respond. He just sat there, his hands resting on the table, his gaze fixed on their joined hands. And then, as if some realization had clicked inside of him, he looked up, meeting her eyes with an intensity she hadn't seen in him before. I've been so afraid, Sarah, he admitted quietly. Afraid that if I let myself dream again, I'll just be disappointed. That if I try to live, I'll fail again. I've spent so much time hiding from the future because I'm scared of what it might hold. Sarah's heart swelled with compassion. She had seen that fear before, the paralyzing fear of moving forward, of putting yourself out there again after you've been hurt. But she also knew that the only way to break free of that fear was to embrace it, to step into the unknown, even when it was terrifying. Fear doesn't have to control you, she said softly. It's okay to be afraid. But don't let that stop you from living the life you deserve. You've been through so much, and you've already proven that you can handle more than you ever thought possible. You don't have to have everything figured out right now, but you do have to give yourself the chance to try. The silence between them hung heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if the weight of their words had settled into something deeper, something more profound. Marcus sat back in his chair, looking at Sarah with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "I don't know if I can ever be the person I used to be," he said, his voice low. "But maybe I don't need to be. Maybe I can be someone better." Sarah smiled, the warmth in her chest spreading like a gentle flame. "You already are." And in that moment, something shifted between them, something that transcended words. Marcus was no longer a man bound by the weight of his past. He wasn't defined by his disability, by his fears, or by the mistakes he had made. He was someone who had found a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild his life from the ground up. And Sarah, in her quiet way, had helped him find it. The days that followed were marked by a new sense of purpose for both of them. Marcus began to venture out even more, not just to the diner, but to places he hadn't been in years. He took long walks in the park, visited old friends, and even signed up for a local art class, something he had once loved but abandoned after the accident. Sarah, too, found herself embracing her own dreams more fully. She began researching ways to open her own diner, reaching out to mentors, and making small but significant steps toward turning her vision into reality. They still had their fears, their doubts, and their struggles, but they had also learned that the only way to move forward was to face those challenges together. They weren't alone anymore. They had found something in each other, a kind of quiet strength, a willingness to take risks, and a belief that the future, while uncertain, held possibilities they could never have imagined before. One afternoon, as Sarah finished wiping down the counter and preparing for the dinner rush, Marcus rolled in once again, this time with a large envelope in his lap. His eyes sparkled with an energy she hadn't seen in him before. "What's this?" Sarah asked, her curiosity piqued. Marcus handed her the envelope with a grin. "I think I've taken the first step towards something new." Opening the envelope, Sarah found a letter, and as she read it, her heart skipped a beat. Marcus had enrolled in a program to help people with disabilities start their own businesses. It was a small but significant step, a step toward a future where he could not only heal but create something of his own. Sarah's eyes filled with emotion as she looked up at him. "Marcus, this is incredible." He smiled, the weight of his journey evident in the curve of his lips. "I'm not there yet, but I'm getting there, one step at a time." Sarah stepped forward, her hand gently resting on his. "I'm so proud of you." And for the first time in a long while, Marcus believed it. He wasn't who he used to be, and he wasn't quite who he would become, but he was becoming someone new, someone stronger, braver, and more willing to embrace the future, no matter what it held. Together, they had found their way. And together, they would continue to walk forward, side by side, into the unknown.